The modules you are about to watch were created by the Temple Occupational Therapy interns who were here at CCW during the summer of 2019. Throughout these modules, you will hear from Christina, Mary Beth, Jenny, and Michaela as we help to explain sensory processing and how it can affect both you and participants here at CCW. So if you were able to take the sensory profile, look at your results, and think about yourself as we go through the next couple of slides. Use your results to compare and contrast which items in the coming slides you feel that you relate to. Let's review our senses. There are the 5 that everybody knows about: touch or tactile, sight or visual, hearing or auditory, taste or gustatory, and smell or olfactory. There are also a few more that are not commonly known: proprioception, kinesthesia, and vestibular. All 3 of these senses work together to help us understand how we are moving. Kinesthesia is awareness of body movements. If you took a step forward, your brain understands that your muscle is moving your foot forward instead of backwards due to kinesthesia. Proprioception, on the other hand, refers to only the awareness of your joint position. So for example, taking a step forward, proprioception allows your brain to understand that your hip is bent forward and your foot is now in front of you instead of behind you. Our vestibular system works to help us understand how our entire body is moving in space, such as forward, backwards, or fast or slow. For example, with your eyes closed, you're able to tell if you're moving, stopping, going in a straight line, or going in a circle. Let's move on. We're going to explain the 6 steps involved in sensory processing. Throughout, we'll use a running example. The first step in sensory processing is stimulation. A stimulation can be something that alerts any of your senses. For example, if you're at a parade and someone brushes up against you. The second step is sensory threshold. Each person has a different sensory threshold, which is the amount of stimulation required in order for your brain to register that particular sensation. Since this step is pretty important to understand, we're going to give you a visual. Think about sensory thresholds this way. Imagine 3 different sized containers: a pint of milk, a quart of milk, and a gallon of milk. Each of the containers can hold different amounts of milk before they are filled to the top. The milk would represent the sensory stimulation, and the top of the jar represents the sensory threshold, or the level at which someone understands that a particular sensation is happening. The pint of milk represents someone with a low threshold. This person needs much less milk to be filled to the top, and therefore less sensory input for their body to realize that a sensory stimulation has occurred. The gallon of milk represents someone with a high threshold. The opposite can be said about an individual with a high threshold. This person needs much more milk to be filled to the top and more sensory input for their body to realize that a sensory stimulation has occurred. But we can't forget about the quart. This represents that sensory thresholds occur on a spectrum. Every individual is different and can fall anywhere between a low and a high threshold. It's also crucial to recognize that it's not uncommon to have a very low or a very high sensory threshold. This only becomes a sensory processing disorder when someone is unable to appropriately interpret and respond to the sensory stimulation. Now moving back to the circle of sensory processing. Let's think about the previous example. Someone brushes up against you at a parade. If your threshold was met by the touch sensation, you move on to registration, the third step in sensory processing. During this step, your sensory threshold has been met and your brain is aware that a sensory stimulation has occurred. So your brain would fully recognize that someone has brushed up against you. The fourth step is orient. Now your brain tries to figure out which sense is being stimulated. What was that? Was it touch, sound, or taste? And then the 5th step is interpretation. In this step, your brain characterizes the sense. Was it light touch or hard touch? Who was that person who brushed up against me? Then our brains are called to respond. In this scenario, let's say that your response is to step away from the person so that they're not able to brush up against you again. And then you move on to the 6th step, which is learning. Your brain is able to store each of these small sensory experiences and assign meaning to them. So that way, if the same situation happens again, you know what to do. So if someone brushed up against you again at that parade, you know that it's not harmful, and a correct response is to step away from them. So next, we're going to break down the 4 quadrants of sensory processing with a chart. There are 2 factors to consider when understanding sensory preferences. One of them is an individual's sensory threshold, which we discussed earlier. So remember those different size containers? That's represented by the red arrow here, where low threshold is a pint and the high threshold is a gallon milk jug. This is how much sensory information someone needs to understand that they're being touched, or that you hear something, or that any other sense is happening. Remember, within these senses, an individual's threshold can be different. For example, someone can have a high threshold for touch, but a low threshold for sound. Further, within each sense, someone's threshold can vary depending on characteristics of stimulation. So for example, with touch, someone may seek out a specific texture of sand, but avoid the texture of grass. So the second factor is someone's behavioral response, which is represented here by the yellow arrow. If you remember back to the example from earlier, the response was someone taking a step back from someone who had brushed up against them at a parade. Someone with a low behavioral response might not react or respond at all to this, while someone with a high behavioral response might perform an assertive action to either avoid or seek a sense. But remember, this is a continuum, and typically, behaviors fall somewhere in the middle. By combining these two factors, someone's preferences fall into one of the 4 quadrants. We'll dive into each quadrant in the coming modules. So, as we've said before, individuals with a higher sensory threshold require more sensory stimuli for the sensation to be registered in their brain, and sometimes it's difficult for these individuals to meet such a high threshold. These individuals can be described as a low register or a sensory seeker, and the difference is the level of behavioral response, or the amount of activity that someone responds with. A low register requires a lot of stimulation to meet their threshold, but these individuals will not seek it out themselves, so this is a low behavioral response. They may sometimes be described as lazy or unmotivated, but that's not typically the case. Their threshold is simply not being met, and they are unsure about how to fulfill those needs. On the other end of the behavioral spectrum, a sensory seeker also needs more sensory input, but these folks will go out of their way to seek out the extra stimulation that they need, and this would be considered a high behavioral response. These individuals may be seen as extremely active. The following are some examples of behaviors that someone with a high threshold might display. They may enjoy loud noises, strong-tasting foods, or lots of touch. They may also prefer hard surfaces to sit on, bright colors, strong smells, lots of movement, and deep pressure, which may be provided by a weighted item or tight clothing. It's important to remember that individuals may have different thresholds for each sense. For example, someone may have a high threshold for smell, but a low threshold for movement. Individuals with a lower sensory threshold require less sensory stimuli for the sensation to register in their brain. Individuals with a low sensory threshold meet their needs very easily. These individuals can be described as being sensory sensitive or a sensory avoider. Again, this is based on the level of behavioral response, or the amount of activity that someone responds with. Someone who is sensory sensitive requires only a little stimulation to meet their threshold, yet they will not actively try to avoid the unpleasant sensations, so this is a low behavioral response. These individuals may seem easily agitated or angry because they are uncertain of how to change the situation or how to make themselves more comfortable. On the other end of the behavioral spectrum, a sensory avoider also requires little stimulation to meet their threshold, but will go out of their way to avoid sensory stimulation, so this is a high behavioral response. These individuals may be frequently seen to leave the environment, avoid certain things pretty consistently, or change the situation in order to avoid the high sensory stimulation. The following are some behaviors you may observe for individuals with a low sensory threshold. They may prefer quiet environments, bland foods, light touch, or even no touch at all. And they might also avoid messy activities. They might dislike fluorescent lights or dislike strong perfumes or air fresheners. Someone with a low sensory threshold might even limit their amount of movement and deep pressure, like hugs, since these experiences can cause extreme discomfort. Again, each of these senses can fall into a different sensory threshold. Let's go back to your results. Think about each of your senses and which quadrants you may fall into. Keep in mind that each of your senses may fall into a different category, and that this is not at all uncommon. Now that you know the basics, the next couple modules will look at each quadrant in depth and provide you with common examples that you may see from day to day at CCW.